Imagine, if you will, a day steeped in crimson and lace, a celebration of love, both new and eternal. But love, like life, carries shadows, echoes of those we've lost, whispers of hearts left longing. Tonight, we step into a space where sorrow meets hope, and the past reaches out with gentle hands to guide the present. Here, love endures beyond time, and even in the quiet darkness, its light flickers on. Tonight, we present the Wail of the Banshee.
The wind howled across the desolate moors, carrying with it the faint cries of something neither human nor beast. Beneath the silver glow of a crescent moon, Eilis stood at the edge of Blackthorn Glen, the ancient graveyard she had dreamed of since childhood. The iron gates loomed before her, their intricate filigree twisted with ivy and thyme. Somewhere beyond them lay answers to questions she had been too afraid to ask. Until now. Eilis pulled her wool coat tighter, the February air biting through her layers. Valentine's Day decorations still hung in the village shop windows behind her, their cheerful hearts and ribbons a stark contrast to the somber task ahead. She touched the silver locket at her throat, remembering the day her father had given it to her, just months before his cancer diagnosis. "It was your mother's," he had said, his eyes clouding with memories. "She wore it every day until..." His voice had trailed off then, as it always did when speaking of her mother. Now, weeks after his passing, his final words echoed in her mind. "Find your mother's resting place. You'll understand once you're there." The village of Blackthorn Hollow was much as she remembered it from her childhood visits, its cobbled streets winding like veins around weathered cottages and an old church steeple. Time had dulled its charm, and the villagers seemed wary, their stares following her as though she carried the spectre of her father's death with her. The whispers began almost immediately, hushed voices behind half-shuttered windows. She had spent her first day in the village at O'Connor's pub, where old Seamus O'Connor still pulled pints behind the same weathered bar. His eyes had widened at the sight of her, recognition dawning slowly. "Little Eilis Murphy," he had breathed, setting down the glass he'd been polishing. "You're the image of your mother, God rest her soul." Over a steaming mug of whiskey-laced coffee, Seamus had shared tales she'd never heard before. "Your mother was special," he'd said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. She could see things others couldn't. The good folk, the spirits. They spoke to her, they did. Some said she was touched by the other world. He paused, glancing around the empty pub. The night she disappeared, the Banshee's cry echoed through the whole village. Now, standing before the graveyard gates, those words sent a shiver down her spine. The graveyard stretched beyond her sight, a labyrinth of tilted headstones and moss-covered crypts. As she pushed the gate open, the air grew heavier, the sounds of the village fading until only the rustle of leaves and the distant crash of waves against cliffs remained. Her breath frosted in the chill air, and she clutched the locket tighter. The inscription, Gra gan Crioch, a Gaelic phrase that loosely translated to endless love, pressed cold against her fingers. A sudden movement caught her eye. Through the mist, a shadow flitted between the headstones. It was too quick to be human, too solid to be mere mist. Her heart pounded as she stepped forward, drawn toward the figure despite the instinct to turn and run. The closer she moved, the louder the wailing became, rising and falling like a mournful melody. The sound was almost human, filled with anguish so profound it made her chest ache. She paused by a weathered headstone, her hand brushing against its cold surface. The name etched there was barely legible, but the date, 1687, stood out starkly. A whisper, soft as a sigh, reached her ears. Eilis. She froze, her name dissolving into the wind. Her heart hammered in her chest. Somewhere ahead, the shadow stopped and turned, its outline sharp against the moonlit mist. Eilis took a shaky breath and stepped deeper into the graveyard, the pull of the unknown stronger than fear. The mist curled around her feet like ghostly fingers as she ventured deeper. The shadow seemed to linger just beyond her reach, flickering between the headstones as though leading her onward. Her pulse quickened with every step, but she couldn't stop now. The spectral wail had softened, replaced by an eerie silence that was somehow more unsettling. Her thoughts wandered as she walked. She remembered the stories her father used to tell her about Blackthorn Glen, tales of restless spirits and a family curse. But she had always dismissed them as superstitions, relics of an old world she had tried to leave behind in pursuit of her modern life in Boston. Now, with every breath of cold air and every whisper of the wind, she wondered how much truth those stories might hold. Earlier that day, Mrs. O'Brien at the village shop had pulled her aside, pressing a bundle of dried herbs into her hand. "For protection," she'd whispered, her rheumy eyes serious. The veil between worlds grows thin near La Fele Valentine, or Valentine's Day. That's when they say Aoibheann walks again, searching for her long-lost love. She stumbled upon a large, ornate crypt set apart from the rest. Its marble surface was worn by centuries of rain and wind, and moss clung to its intricate carvings. Above the entrance, the name Tadhg and Aoibheann was chiseled in fading Gaelic script. The sight of it sent a chill through her. That name had been in the stories Seamus had told her. Tadhg and Aoibheann was the village's most eligible bachelor, he'd said, until he fell in love with Aoibheann, a beautiful woman from the fairy mounds. They say she had hair like moonlight and a voice that could charm the birds from the trees. But their love was forbidden by both worlds. On the eve of a La Fele Valentine, when they planned to elope, Tadhg's family intervened. In their struggle to keep them apart, a violent struggle ensued and Tadhg was killed. Aoibheann's grief was so profound that she decided to end her life, and some believe became the Banshee, forever wailing for her lost love. Eilis ran her fingers over the stone, feeling the grooves of the letters as though they were part of her own history. She turned to see the shadow standing still for the first time. It was the figure of a woman, her translucent form glowing faintly in the moonlight. Her face was delicate, but contorted with sorrow. Her long hair flowing, as if caught in an invisible breeze. This was the Banshee, Aoibheann, her eyes holding centuries of grief. The spirit reached out a hand toward the crypt, her eyes pleading. "Please!" The Banshee's voice was like a song, mournful yet compelling. "You must help me find him." "Him?" Eilis asked, her voice trembling. She wasn't sure if she expected an answer, but the Banshee nodded, gesturing toward the crypt door. The heavy door creaked open under her touch, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. Eilis hesitated, the air growing colder as she peered into the shadows below. Taking a deep breath, she descended, each step echoing in the silence. At the bottom, she found a small chamber lit faintly by an otherworldly glow. In the center lay an unmarked stone coffin, its lid cracked and slightly ajar. Beside it rested an object that caught Eilis's eye, a silver ring engraved with the same Gaelic phrase as her locket. She picked it up, the metal icy against her skin. As she held it, images flooded her mind. Tadhg and Aoibheann meeting in secret by the fairy mound, their stolen moments in the moonlight, their plans to escape together. She also saw Tadhg's family, their faces twisted with rage and fear, trying to separate them. She watched as Tadhg struggled against his brothers, losing his footing on the cliff's edge. She felt Aoibheann's scream of anguish tear through time itself. The vision ended as abruptly as it began, leaving Eilis gasping for air. The Banshee stood at the entrance to the chamber, her eyes filled with tears. "Bring us peace," she whispered, her form beginning to fade. But there was more. Another vision struck her. Her mother, standing in this very crypt years ago, holding the same ring. She saw her mother's face, so like her own, filled with determination as she worked to uncover the truth. Then, darkness, a struggle, a fatal fall. Understanding dawned. Her mother hadn't abandoned them. She had died trying to help the spirits find peace. Eilis clutched the ring tightly, tears streaming down her face. She was the last of her line, the only one left who could set things right. But how? And at what cost? The questions swirled in her mind as she ascended back into the graveyard, the moonlight illuminating her path. As she emerged from the crypt, she noticed the graveyard seemed different. The mist had thinned, and the wailing of the Banshee had stopped. But the silence brought no comfort. It was heavy with anticipation. Clutching the ring, Eilis walked toward a cluster of graves surrounding an ancient oak, the tree's gnarled branches reaching toward the heavens. The Banshee reappeared beside her, calmer now, her anguish muted. "The tree," she said, her voice barely more than a breath. "This is where we first met, where we pledged our love." Eilis approached, feeling the weight of the ring grow heavier with each step. At the base of the tree lay a small, unmarked stone, half buried in centuries of earth. Understanding guided her actions. She knelt and placed both the ring and her mother's locket on the stone. The ground trembled lightly, and both pieces began to glow. Before Eilis's eyes, the stone shifted and grew, forming into a headstone engraved with both Tadhg's name and Aoibheann's, joined by their shared motto, Tadhg and Aoibheann, love without end. A spectral figure emerged from the tree's shadow, a young man with piercing eyes and a gentle smile. The Banshee gasped, her sorrow transforming into joy. "Tadhg," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. The two spirits embraced, their forms glowing brighter until they became one with the moonlight. As they faded, a third spirit appeared briefly, a woman with Eilis's eyes and smile. Her mother. She didn't speak, but her pride and love radiated through the graveyard. She pressed a ghostly kiss to Eilis's forehead before disappearing into the dawn's first light. The graveyard felt lighter, the air no longer oppressive but peaceful. Where the spirits had stood, a bunch of wild roses had sprouted, blooming impossibly in the February cold. Eilis picked one, tucking it into her coat as she walked away from Blackthorn Glen. The village was stirring as she emerged from the graveyard. Valentine's Day decorations caught the morning light, their meanings somehow deeper now. She understood at last why her father had waited until his death to send her here. Some truths could only be found when the heart was ready to receive them. As she passed O'Connor's pub, old Seamus stood in the doorway. He took one look at her face and nodded, understanding in his eyes. "The wailing has stopped," he said simply. "For the first time in centuries, there'll be peace in Blackthorn Hollow." Eilis smiled, touching the rose in her coat. She carried with her now the knowledge of 3 great loves, one that had transcended death, one that had given its life in pursuit of truth, and one that had waited patiently for her to discover both. The village's whispers had ceased, and as she walked toward her future, she felt her mother's presence beside her, guiding her home at last.
And so, dear listeners, we close this chapter of love and longing, a tale that reminds us that even in the shadow of loss, hope can bloom anew, and love's light can guide us forward. Thank you for stepping into this realm of bittersweet beauty with us tonight. Your time, your imagination, and your open hearts mean more than words can say. Until we meet again, may your days be filled with wonder, and may love, no matter its form, always find its way to you. Good night, and farewell for now.